of a series of webinars that Save the Children is hosting to talk about the advocacy and campaigning work within our organization. The child poverty is one of our global initiatives, and although on our online training we don't have specific modules for the global initiatives, we have taken the opportunity to have a discussion with the leads of the global initiatives about what advocacy means in their work. So for today, I'm really glad to introduce Richard Morgan, who will be joining us from the Child Poverty Network. Really exciting because the Child Poverty Network is the Child Poverty GI is one of our latest GIs in Save the Children. Before we start, I just want to check that everybody is able to hear me and that they're able to see the PowerPoint. If you do have a microphone and have any questions, please feel free to unmute your microphone and ask the question. If you are struggling to use your microphone, you're also more than welcome to type your question into the IM section of the webinar. You can see in the bottom left-hand side that I have typed in my contact details if anybody has any questions, so you can email me at advocacytraining@savethechildren.org. And I've also included a link to the Advocacy and Campaign online training course, which is available to Save the Children staff. You just give us 1 minute. We're just trying to... Okay. Sorry. Welcome, everybody. My name is Shani Winterstein. I work in the global campaign team at Save the Children International Center. This is one of our series of webinars that we're hosting on advocacy and campaigning in Save the Children. This is as a complement to our online training course that's available to Save the Children staff on OneNet. For those of you that have just joined us, you'll find the link to that course on the left-hand side in the IM section. Part of this course is providing an overview of the different types of advocacy that happens within Save the Children. And in that area, we're also looking at the various GIs or global initiatives within Save the Children. This is the first of our webinars with a lead from one of the GIs. So this is Richard Morgan, who's joining us from the Child Poverty GI. Richard has recently joined us from UNICEF, where he was a senior advisor on the post-2015 development agenda. And he was responsible for promoting children's rights and equity through the engagement of multi-stakeholder processes leading up to 2015. Richard was also the deputy director of of policy and practice at UNICEF in New York, responsible for organizational standards and practices in the areas of gender equality, child rights, reaching marginalized children, children and youth participation, and communication for development, C4D for many of us. Richard also led UNICEF's work on child statistics and advocacy for child-focused pro-poor social and economic policies. Before this, Richard worked in Africa for more than 2 decades as a rural development specialist, economic and social sector advisor, and humanitarian program manager. He was a civil servant for 7 years at the government of Botswana at central and local levels, working on household food security, livelihoods, and poverty reduction programs before joining UNICEF. Richard is a graduate of the University of Oxford and got his master's degree in development economics at the University of East Anglia. So with that very fantastic introduction, welcome, Richard. I hope we can hear you.
Hi, thank you, Shani. I'm here. Hi,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I know people have got a lot of questions about the child poverty GI, in part because it's a new GI. Do you want to just give us a little bit of background of how did the child poverty GI emerge and when was it set up?
Well, it was officially adopted by Save Children International Board on 1st of October, so it's less than 2 months old in an official sense. But I think it reaches back into several years of work, if not decades of work, that Save the Children has done, particularly around livelihoods for the poorest families, some of the poorest families in the world, families with children. Some of the work we've done in previous years and now around adolescents and young people and how they can be helped with skills and confidence to engage in the transition to work as they become young adults. So our livelihoods work, our youth work, and in recent years growing involvement by Save the Children in social protection, including cash transfers and other ways of helping families secure more reliably their incomes and their ability to invest in their own children, both in normal times and in times of shocks and humanitarian crises. So all of this ongoing work, I think the idea was that there should be a global initiative, or at least a way in which thematically we could put greater coherence into these different strands of work, that we could focus on essentially the household economy, helping poor families with children in all kinds of societies, not just the poorest countries, but also poor families in wealthier societies, and also children living outside of family care who equally are materially deprived. I always like to say that there are 2 articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child that provide a foundation for this work. Articles 26 and 27 look at the material situation of children, that they have enough to eat, that families can feed them and clothe them and so forth. And so there's a strong established basis in child rights for this kind of work on the family economy. Just if we look at this slide, our vision is essentially about breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty in order to achieve our breakthroughs and save the children. In other words, if families are extremely poor, they're not going to have sufficient money and other resources to ensure that their children live in early childhood, that they thrive and grow on the basis of good nutritional development, that they learn. Families need money both for food and to keep children in school. School normally has some kind of costs, whether official or unofficial. And it's also easier for families who have at least a basic income to keep their children safe, whereas families who are under huge economic stress and shocks are often have very little choice but to pull their children out of school, or one or more children, and place them in potentially harmful situations in many cases, just in terms of sheer survival. So income is good, and reliable incomes are desirable for us, but they also serve to help us achieve our ambitions for children in terms of their survival, learning, and safety. So maybe, Shani, we could look at I think there are 3 more slides if we just want to go through them quickly as an introduction, if you would like.
Great. All right, Richard. So moving on to the next slide. So indicative results. So this is what we're trying to achieve by 2030. And I'm assuming this is what's going to feed into our 2030 strategy. Can you also just give us a little bit of a sense of how these were developed? And you spoke about the child poverty initiative coming out of work that Save the Children is already doing. So if you could also talk about if you do have any examples of countries where we're actually doing some of this work. I think it will also help for our listeners to really be able to link this to the work that we do on the ground.
Right. We'll have a look at these results briefly, I think, but just before that, I think Save the Children has experience, probably both successes and unsuccesses, let's say, in almost all regions. I would say in all regions, and I'm including what we call domestic programs in some of the wealthier countries, where, for example, in the UK and other parts of Europe, there are programs to support very poor families in these European societies, with transfers, with support for their children's learning and so forth. So I think there are examples in what we used to call the North and what we used to call the South, East and West. We have a steering committee that we've put in place to guide and support the new global initiative on child poverty. And this has membership from different regions. For example, Brazil and South Africa are two of the newer Save the Children members who are on our steering committee. And both Brazil and South Africa have extensive social protection programs, probably among the largest on their respective continents. We have country office representation from Ethiopia and from Bangladesh, which are two countries where Save the Children has, I think, multi-tracked programs or different types of programs addressing different aspects of child poverty. And we have a number of members from the Europe, Australia, North America as well, that are supporting the new global initiative. So the steering committee has guided us, a core team now of 3, and we'll introduce the core team on the last slide, to draft these results for 2030, which would feed into Save the Children's overall strategy that's emerging for 2030. I won't read them out, but just to point out what each one is about, and ending up with an advocacy result or an advocacy goal for the global initiative. The first result is about families having sufficient income at all times so they can afford to buy food and other items that are necessary for their children's well-being. So that's family income. The second one also is about family income from the perspective that families shouldn't be so absolutely poor or destitute that they have to place their kids in harmful situations, or put
So
them in.
that's what you were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of helping us with our breakthroughs. Those two would
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, carry on.
that's right. So the third one is about families having a certain level of economic resilience, that when there are shocks, whether it's a drought or a flood or conflict or an epidemic like Ebola as we're seeing now, that families have some way to maintain their basic spending on children, their children's food, their children's clothing, and sending children to school and taking them to the health facility when they're sick.
Richard, I just want to stop you there on the economic resilience. Resilience is a very kind of discussed concept in the development sector as well as the humanitarian. Tell us specifically what we're talking about here. You say economic resilience. What resilience are we not including when you put down economic resilience?
We're focusing here on a basic level of income. Now, what that level of income should be is very controversial. Because, for example, the World Bank defines extreme poverty as equivalent to $1.25 US cents a day per person in a household, and that is, to some of us, extraordinarily low as a sort of a poverty line. In other societies, you look at the average income or the mean income and look at how far families fall beneath the average or the median. And what we're saying is families should have an economic floor. Either they should be able to build up some savings, some assets like livestock or some credit that they can draw down on in very bad times, or if they don't have those savings and minimal assets, they need to be supported. They need a cash support or some resource transfer to help them through these shocks. So that's a sense of resilience, that families at all times would be able to be at least above a very basic minimum income level so that they can continue to feed and clothe their kids.
Great.
The fourth result, now this is important because we haven't really touched on this very much, is about working with adolescents and young people and
Mhm.
supporting them with opportunities to gain the skills that they need, both hard skills in terms of numeracy, literacy, if they don't already have it from school, maybe apprenticeship skills, but also soft skills in terms of young people and children's own agency, their self-esteem, the hope they have for the future, in order that they can make a safe and successful transition to young adulthood and be able to earn a living or find a job, that kind of thing.
Now,
So,
tell me, Richard, my sense is that this is not something that Save the Children is strong on. We have a handful of programs that I'm aware of in Jordan and the Middle East around adolescents and young people. But for the most part, this hasn't been a strong area of engagement for us. Is there an intention to strengthen this?
well, we'll see, I think, very soon when Save the Children's 2030 strategy becomes more clearly defined. Again, what we're doing is reflecting here. As you said, there are a number of programs, maybe more than a few, and a number of country offices and a number of members that are involved in supporting different approaches, I would say, to supporting adolescents and young people. So the question is, yes, do we want to strengthen this? Let's see what the intention of the movement turns out to be. If we do intend to strengthen it, I think there's quite a bit to draw on. And I would say for all of these areas, for social protection, for livelihoods, for working with adolescents and young people, we're doing an inventory. We've started a mapping of what's going on across our countries and our membership to try to understand better what does exist and what the patterns are. And we're also looking outside what other partners are doing. For example, the Population Council is another organization that works extensively, Commonwealth, and there are many that work with adolescents and young people.
Great to know.
Let
When
me
do you
just,
think that, sorry, just before you go into the last point, Richard, when do you think that mapping is going to be available? I know lots of people that will be very interested in that within Save the Children.
well, I'm sitting next to my colleague Bushu Munoz here, and I think she would say, we would say early next year.
Good to know. Good to know.
But we're not promising. We have to see. What we've, I would say, encountered so far is there's quite a bit of fragmentation in our databases, and partly because this global initiative on child poverty is brand new. It means that our tracking systems for expenditure, for grants, for program coding, and so on, were not set up until now to specifically identify activities that might fall under this new global initiative. We're retrofitting to a certain extent. We're doing a bit of detective work, looking at the country annual plans, looking at the child rights situation analyses, and trying to uncover, where some of these programs are. And I should say, quite a bit of child poverty work is within other sectors. In health, there are cash transfers for health and nutrition, in education, and so on. There's work, a lot of good work, I think, in child rights governance that looks at investing in children, particularly poor children, through public expenditure. So there's, again, a lot of potential areas where Save the Children does have expertise. Child rights governance would certainly be one, which has also done work on social protection as well as investing in children. So Shani, let me just come to this last result, because this might be of interest, particularly to our colleagues working on advocacy. What we're aiming at here is to get countries, governments to recognize that there is an issue of child poverty, because for many, many years, I think in most countries, poor children have been hidden within the overall issue of poverty. I think, ever since international development got off the ground, maybe 50 years ago, we've been talking about poverty reduction, poverty eradication. You've heard all of this since the beginning of our development efforts worldwide. But very rarely have we heard about child poverty measurement, child poverty identification, targets for reducing or eliminating extreme poverty among children, the impact of poverty on children, and the fact that it's not yet widely recognized, but World Bank data will bear this out. The highest rates of poverty are among children of any human beings. So, in almost all societies for which we have data, children are the most likely people to be poor. So this advocacy effort would be to say, let's try to see if we can form a coalition of partners who are concerned about children in poverty and the deprivations, the various deprivations they suffer as a result of living in very poor families, and get governments to make explicit commitments, targets, and be held accountable for those targets, for reducing child poverty, for eliminating extreme poverty among children. This will be primarily through advocacy, evidence-based advocacy about the fact that children are very poor in many cases, and what works for children to reduce poverty and deprivations.
That's great. And I want to come back to that. I just want to go over to our listeners and see what they've typed. Chris McIver has sent us a quick note about the Middle East region has a youth livelihoods advisor, set youth programming as a key area of strategic focus, partly because of the Arab Spring revolutions that set the tone for many of the countries that we're working on. And I'm aware of that work, and it sounds fantastic, and I'm really excited that we have this child poverty initiative, and I'm hoping there's a platform for us to be able to share all of this information as we move forward, because I'm pretty sure that a lot of our country programs are interested in doing a lot of this work. I'm going to move over to Lisa, Lisa John from our global campaign team, who said, I agree with Richard that our focus at this point must be on addressing intergenerational poverty. The question I have is how we go beyond the deprivation focus to also include a discrimination focus in our agenda, and also look at how crises or shocks, environmental and political, need to be addressed. Richard, would you like to respond to Lisa's question?
Yes, and also I think the previous issue from Chris. I mean, I think again it's absolutely the case that we probably do have rather more experience than we realize in working with young people. Some of it might have been previous efforts which were donor dependent, as much of our work often is, and which kind of faded out as grants ran out. We need to look back and see whether evaluations and documentation exist of previous efforts. We actually were together with the Middle Eastern region's youth livelihoods advisor last week in the group that's now called ELYE, E-L-Y-E. I pronounce it ELYE anyway. It was called I before. And this is looking at, say, the children's experience in at least 4 regions in working with young people and adolescents, with a particular focus on equipping them to navigate the transition to work and livelihoods. It's really worth pointing out that we talk about aging populations in the north. We have to talk about youthing populations, or populations that are getting younger and younger, particularly in Africa, both North and Sub-Saharan Africa. The whole continent is seeing a youth bulge in the making, and is going to be a young continent, so that many of our concerns about child poverty in North and Sub-Saharan Africa in the next 15 years are going to be not only among under 5s and school-age going children, but also adolescents and young adults as well, that new generation of young adults. Lisa's points are 2 very big questions. I mean, I personally believe that child poverty is underpinned by inequalities, something we could go into if we had the time, but I think in societies that are highly unequal, and where the chances, for groups, often people living in slums or remote rural areas, people belonging to minority ethnic groups, children with disabilities, in some societies girls, are structurally disadvantaged, that those inequalities are built into the fabric of society and have been historically for many centuries, and they won't be resolved simply through cash transfers, even though cash transfers might help to some extent in the short term or even have some transformative effect. But these inequalities are deeply embedded in society. They trap groups, children in families which belong to particular groups, in particular locations, in poverty. And the inequalities in turn relate to these kinds of discriminations that often exist in virtually every society, as I've mentioned, relating to ethnicity or caste or race or location or disability and so forth.
Or gender, as Cicely has just brought up. And a follow-up question.
I still have at least a second point. I mean, I want to acknowledge, I don't think I'm going to have time to address it because it's such a big question, but looking at how shocks and crises need to be addressed, I think that's a huge thing, which, I think just to note for now. But going back to our advocacy efforts, I think it's a question for us collectively as a movement, as Save the Children, to what extent strongly and how explicitly we want to try to deal with these underlying factors, not just the fact that poverty exists, it needs to be addressed among children, but the inequalities and types of discrimination that underpin and reinforce poverty among children.
Great. Thanks for that, Richard.
You have a bunch more questions, Shani. I don't know how you want to take them.
Well, I just want to make sure that listeners, if you've got any further questions about that, I know that Serena asked about what the role is of Save the Children in addressing that, and it would be great to get into a little bit more detail, but let me just check if we collected all the other questions. Cicely from Canada has contributed by saying poverty around the world is racialized and grounded in gender. I think we support that point. And if we don't deal with underlying factors, we won't have sustainable change. Absolutely. And I think this is, again, key to the advocacy, which is really looking at the sustainable response to the challenges faced by these communities.
Right.
In terms of the advocacy components, what plan does the new GI have to conduct advocacy work?
We'll have to see how this evolves, Shani. We don't yet have an advocacy plan or strategy. We haven't yet defined advocacy goals or objectives. That's all something to which, folks who are online, who are contributing and listening could contribute. We'd very much welcome your ideas. At the moment, we have just a single result, which in itself is very ambitious, that we advocate together with partners on the basis of some form of coalition or group of coalitions that governments adopt, that they recognize the issue of child poverty in their societies and adopt targets and action plans to address it. We can go much broader, but we do need to discuss and be clear in our steering committee and more broadly whether and to what extent and how we want to address these underlying issues of inequality and different forms of discrimination or different forms of inequalities and discrimination. At the moment, I think that is an open and very actively discussed question.
And Richard, if staff are interested in this and would like to participate in or contribute to the discussion around the advocacy plan, how can they do that?
Well, at the moment, we don't have the mechanism for that yet. We haven't yet begun work to develop an advocacy plan. I think we are in a process where we're looking to see what guidance will come from the movement as a whole as it formulates its strategy for 2030, and then we'll work within that broad framework. So to me, these questions of, well, I think child poverty is in some sense foundational as our child rights and child rights governance for the whole work of Save the Children. And then the question is, how do we address these issues that impact on all of our other work, our work around survival, learning, protection, and so forth? How strongly and clearly and explicitly do we want to address these issues around poverty, inequality, and discrimination? Once we have a better sense of that, I think then we'll see how we develop advocacy approaches and strategies in a participatory way. At the moment, again, we're having initial conversations. We're we're having this discussion. We've had 3 or 4 webinars with staff on the global initiative. I've met with our colleagues in the domestic programs. We have our steering committee. Let us know your views through these channels and directly as well. Please, contact us directly if you'd like to contribute. But I think we'll take this back and we'll see how we can collectively and in an open and participatory way develop an advocacy approach.
I mean, I think that's a great opportunity, and I do encourage staff to get in contact with Richard and his team on this. I just want to quickly go to the slide, Richard, of your team, and if you could just talk through who makes up the Child Poverty GI and who people should contact for further questions. I think that'd be incredibly helpful for staff to know on this.
Thanks, Shani. So, well, you see myself, I'm the only male on the team, and we are a team of 4. Sylvia is our Deputy Director. She will start on the 1st of December. She's supported and hosted by Save the US. So whereas I'm based in London, Shani will be based in Washington, D.C. Sorry, not Shani, Sylvia. Sylvia, yeah. And Sylvia is going to lead on our adolescent and youth livelihoods work and our efforts to create a more coherent and coordinated approach across Save the Children on adolescents and youth livelihoods. I'll be leading technically on social protection and householding. Burcu Munoz is our senior global program manager, and among other things, she'll be constructing our knowledge network and knowledge hubs, arranging to look at evaluations and documentation on our different thematic areas across the movement. And Kate Kenny is our communications manager. Kate is with us on the call. So Kate will also be helping us with communications and building a coalition of partners as a basis for future advocacy. So I think, contact all of us. Burcu and I have Save UK addresses. So if you just use the standard formula for Save UK, Kate has SaveTheChildren.org. I believe Sylvia will as well.
Okay, great. So just for those that don't know, the Save UK formulation is rmorgan@savethechildren.org.uk, so that you can have that. Just a last comment that's come in from Lisa. I just want to make sure we're giving our listeners time to speak and to give contributions. An advocacy engagement would be really interesting to see if we can work together with the GI to frame reactions and responses to external situations from a child poverty lens. A focus on how the Ebola outbreak is deepening child poverty, for instance, and what governments and the global community need to do. I think our capacity at the moment is much more geared towards providing immediate relief and response rather than addressing the deeper structural factors. So Richard, your thoughts on this, and perhaps a little bit of input in terms of what work you're planning to do within the context of the humanitarian response as a key area of Save the Children engagement.
Yeah, again, I think we always faced with a dilemma or the need to create a balance between ensuring immediate life-saving and recovery responses, the shorter-term humanitarian responses, while at the same time building or rebuilding systems and helping to expand the capacity of systems to deal with shocks. I mean, I suppose it can be argued that Ebola is such a severe a crisis in parts of West Africa precisely because those are the societies with some of the weakest health systems in the first place, lacking the ability to manage and contain pandemic outbreaks, epidemics like Ebola, and other killer diseases for children. So, investing in systems while at the same time saving lives, I think, has got to be somehow combined. But I agree again with Lisa that there are deeper structural factors. You can look at overall questions of why certain societies stay poor. Why are some parts of West Africa considerably poorer than others, and and much less able to cope with Ebola and other types of life-threatening situations for children. There are historical roots, there are political factors, there are cultural factors, and certainly economic factors involved. And I think it's good if we can understand these. I mean, I would say one thing, I don't hide the fact that I joined Save the Children after working for UNICEF, and I think there's a lot that can be done in linking up with other child-focused organizations, particularly other organizations that adopt a child rights-based approach to understanding children's lives. Let's work together on capacity development, on building systems, on advocacy with our government counterparts and with mayors and politicians, municipalities, and so on, with community leaders. Let's work together on situation analysis, child rights situation analysis. They don't always need to be agency-specific exercises, as long as partners are working together, particularly with national and local partners, to understand the situation of children, the trends and the factors affecting children, keeping them poor, malnourished, and not learning and not safe. These are things where we can pool our limited resources in different organizations to get some sort of collective synergy, I think.
And I think that type of partnership and joint initiative is key to what Save the Children's success is going to be in much of this work, because as Cicely has just commented, how will we address the fact that we don't have significant depth across the movement in terms of economic analysis? And this, in my mind, what you've just spoken about, Richard, in terms of those partnerships, is where we don't attempt to have all the expertise, but rather look to partnerships that will bring in some of those expertise. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different thought on this? Is there a need for Save the Children to up our capacity to do economic analysis?
I think probably yes, there probably is a need, given our ambition to start addressing child poverty more systematically. But my first question in all of this would be, do we know how much economic capacity, how much analytical capacity we actually do have, and how much we can obtain? It's not clear to me that we actually know who and where our talent and expertise lies. There are a number of livelihoods advisors. There are a number of countries where Save the Children has supported household economic analysis, for example. Just in one member alone, I'm aware of a number of people who work as livelihoods advisors, both at the regional and country level, and I'm sure there are many across the movement. So there might be somewhat more economic expertise than we think. That's the first question. Whether that's the case, we need to find out. Secondly, are we using that economic expertise? You often find, and I say this as somebody who originally did work as an economist, that economists are often used as planners, for example, and not as economic analysts. They're used to design and implement and monitor and evaluate projects and programs, which might be fine, but it also means that if we wanted, we might sort of uncover and somewhat reallocate some of the expertise we have. And then thirdly, as you were saying, there are a number of ways we can partner. For example, many countries, even very poorest countries, have institutes of economic analysis. They have economics departments at the national university. They have some think tank expertise. If we can get finance ministries and even central banks to start getting interested in children, for the first time in many cases, there's no reason why that can't also be a source of expertise, and so on. We can work with regional and sub-regional economic organizations as well and get them focused on children, where children have often been neglected.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great point for Save the Children moving forward, is recognizing that we often have hidden gems of capacity within our staff, but also that we really need to be looking at our local levels and seeing what kind of capacity exists there and the potential partnerships. And I know from the advocacy and campaign training course, we're always telling people to look outside of the usual suspects for partnerships, for influentials, for even targets about engagement. So the Ministry of Finance is often not considered in a lot of advocacy strategies, but actually is an incredibly key player with regards to allocation of resources. So from an advocacy point of view, they often come up as a key influential in the process and somebody or an entity that needs to be engaged. At the same time, the broader partnerships with civil society are also key for just building that momentum and changing public opinion around the importance of addressing these issues. And I see in some of your notes you talk about the Coalition Against Child Poverty. Who is in this and what does it do?
Well, it's about to be born.
Oh, good.
We're having our first face-to-face meeting next week of a core group of organizations that we hope at the end of a couple of days will come out with a global coalition in the making with its first work plan, with its first advocacy objectives. We have some of the other child-focused agencies, UNICEF, World Vision. We have some research organizations like Young Lives, which does cohort studies in 4 countries, Fourth World, ATD. We have the African Child Policy Forum and BRAC from a couple of the major regions, Africa and Asia. We have ECLAC from Latin America and so forth. So there are about 15 organizations that have expressed interest, enthusiasm. They would like to be part of something. We're just about to try to define what that something will be in terms of concrete objectives and ways of working. It'll be very networked. It won't be, something with a secretariat, because we just don't have the money to formalize any structures or create any new structures. But it'll be networked with initial support from us in Save the Children and our friends at UNICEF to get this off the ground.
Well, that sounds incredibly interesting, and I'm pretty sure all of our listeners would be very interested in hearing more about that. So if you could, if there's any way you could share with us a concept note or let us know when we could expect to see some of the outcomes of that coalition, I think that would be incredibly valuable. Richard, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our discussion, but this is a question I ask all of the participants on these webinars. What are some of your top tips around child poverty that you want people to keep in mind, specifically around advocacy? If you want people to think about, consider, and do effective advocacy around child poverty, what are some of the key things they need to have at the back of their heads, and some top tips that they could have for their consideration?
I think we need to illuminate the issue of child poverty with most adults on this planet. Most adults on this planet are, in my view, partially blind or even wholly blind to the fact that children not only are the most likely to be poor among all of us, but also suffer the greatest harms, often invisible harms. Children who grow up stunted, children who don't realize their full cognitive potential, children who suffer trauma because of abuse linked to the fact they're not protected because their family structures are too weak. All of these are linked to poverty. We need to illuminate or even expose the issue. Use whatever evidence is to hand. Some of the evidence is very patchy, but lack of evidence doesn't mean lack of a problem. Child poverty can be devastating to hundreds of millions of children across the world and in virtually all our societies without there being any statistical evidence, because adults simply haven't bothered to collect it, haven't invested in systems to disaggregate data, which can be done from census, from household income and expenditure surveys, from sample surveys, to demonstrate that children are poor, how they're affected in many different ways by poverty. So lack of evidence isn't evidence of a lack of a problem. And even talking, well, not even, especially talking to children, listening to children, capturing their testimony of their life experiences, growing up in poverty with different forms of deprivation, we need to put that front and center with decision makers and influence makers among adults. We need to open the eyes of people who have been blind to child poverty, including many of our major institutions who talk about poverty as if it wasn't about people, it was just about numbers and statistics, and don't think of the people who are most affected by different forms of poverty.
Well, those are incredibly helpful thoughts to leave our listeners with. Richard, thank you so much for your time. I found this incredibly informative. I hope we can have further conversations in future. Best of luck with the Coalition Against Child Poverty, and do let us know how things progress. I'm pretty sure there is a page on OneNet for the child poverty GI. Kate Kenny is the person who in most cases is managing that. Her email is on this last slide that I'll just return to. And thank you so much for everybody's participation. As we said, this webinar has been recorded, and we'll have the recording available on OneNet for staff to look at. If you found this interesting, please do encourage other staff to listen to the webinar and to engage with the Child Poverty GI on the issues. I'm really looking forward to the mapping that we expect hopefully in 2015. No pressure. I think, as you said, there is a lot of work happening, and as we saw from the comments, a lot of people started speaking about the work happening in various parts of Save the Children. So thank you again for your participation, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Shani. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure being with you. We look forward to working with you going forward.
All right. Bye-bye.